Hello everyone, and welcome back to Inside ArtScroll, where the books you read and the people who write them come to life. It's a tremendous honor to be joined today by Rabbi Nosson Scherman, longtime editor of the ArtScroll series. Thank you, Rabbi Scherman, for giving us some time to talk.
Pleasure to be here.
Likewise. So, many people know you as what I would call the father of contemporary English Torah literature, the longtime editor of ArtScroll. You've given Klal Yisrael tremendous contributions in many different forms, and we'll get into some of them. But I'd love to hear about your history growing up in Newark, New Jersey. If you could tell us about that.
I was born in Newark, 1935. Now you know the secret. And I went to public school until I was 10 years old. And it was, when I was in school, it was during World War II, obviously. And there were all sorts of controls. You could not evict a tenant, you could not buy a house because of the war effort. So we were living in a rundown neighborhood, and I went to a school which was not the best school in the world, but it was enjoyable. You know, I got along with everybody. We had, in fact, it was almost exclusively a black neighborhood at that time, and there were 3 white kids in the class, and that was considered a white class. I was really a pioneer of integration before Martin Luther King came along. And I played with them, we played baseball, we did all sorts of things together. There was no friction whatsoever. There was no day school for me to go to. The day school in Newark started a year after I began school. So when I was in the 4th grade, they were up to the 3rd grade, et cetera. And when I was in the 6th grade, my parents decided that they had to send me to Yeshiva because Newark did not have the proper educational system. I have to give a lot of credit to Lubavitch. It was Lubavitcher Talmud Torah, which at that time was run by Rabbi Shalom Gordon, a truly great man. And he became a close friend of the family after I was away in Yeshiva. And I have to give him a lot of credit for stimulating me, inspiring me to want to go on to learn. He built up this Lubavitcher Talmud Torah beautifully. Then when it reached about 200 Talmidim, they sent him to Worcester, Massachusetts to start a school there. And from then on, the Talmud Torah went down. Mm-hmm. But I was there during his prime years. And when I was 10, I went to Torah Vodaas in a dormitory, no less. Came home for Shabbos, but I was in a dormitory all week. And I stayed in Torah Vodaas through elementary school, the Yeshiva Torah, Mesifta, Beis Medrash, and Beis Medrash Elyon, and Kailul.
So for what grades were you in the Talmud Torah in Newark?
Well, I started when I was 8 years old. And I was there till I was 10.
Got it.
It was interesting, you know, the world has changed. For me to get to the Talmud Torah, when he was a little kid, you know, I was 8, 9 years old. I was taking 2 buses after school. And my parents were not afraid to let me travel. It never dawned on any of us that there was any danger, and there wasn't any danger. Times have changed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, how many Jewish families were living in Newark at the time?
When I was growing up, believe it or not, Newark was a city of 430,000, and there were over 60,000 Jews.
So it was a sizable number of Jews.
Over 60,000 Jews, and there was no yeshiva, there was no day school.
So no yeshiva, no day school, but there were shuls, I imagine.
Oh, there were shuls galore. And but the power structure in the city, the Jewish community was reform and conservative. in the Orthodox shuls, even the people who came to shul were mostly not Shomer Shabbos. Very few Shomer Shabbos. And mostly elderly people, many of them retired, who had not been Shomer Shabbos while they were working. There were people who were Moser Nefesh for Yiddishkeit. I mean, I don't want to paint a totally dark picture. That kind of picture would not be true. But by and large, the overwhelming majority were not frum. The overwhelming majority did not give their children any Jewish education. I remember we had a mom and pop grocery store on a business street. And there are 3 blocks of stores, almost all of them Jewish owners. And they were such Jewish people when they spoke Lashon Hara. They would say, "Metuner Zindiken," you're not allowed to do an aver. And then they would say what they wanted to say. And on Shabbos, the stores were open, and they would say, "Nishan kegen Shabbos gerät." I knew one man who I consider him one of the great heroes that I ever knew. He came to America and he could not get a job. He couldn't make a living. And it reached a point where he felt he had no choice. And he was a grocer, a grocery store. He was open Shabbos. He was open Shabbos. And in later years, when he moved to a better neighborhood, he would walk 2 miles to get to the store because he didn't want to take the bus on Shabbos. He would figure out whatever math he could do in his head, he would do in his head to avoid writing on Shabbos. He had a shegitz coming in to put on the lights. There's a happy ending. His children and grandchildren are important, very highly respected Talmidei Chachamim and Rabbi Torah in America and in Eretz Yisrael.
And you attribute that to the fact that he demonstrated an adherence, scrupulousness.
His Yiddishkeit was important to him. Mm-hmm. And I've said many, many times, if our generation, my generation, your generation, if we had had the kind of nisyonis that they had, would we remain Shomer Shabbos? I would not want to bet on it. I would not want to bet on myself. Right. They went through terrible, terrible challenges. And they remained Jewish, and they wanted their children to be Jewish.
So how were your parents able to do it despite the challenges financially and socially? They
were committed. My mother was a very strong woman, and her father, well, she came from Ukraine. Her mother was killed in a pogrom. So they sacrificed for the Yiddishkeit. She came to America with her father, and he lived with us. He died on the first day of Rosh Hashanah when I was 8 years old. And I think that had a big influence on the family. He was an Erlich Chassidish Yid with a beard. And my father came from Poland. Both of them had cousins in Newark. That's how they both ended up in Newark, and that's where they married. But they were both strong, committed people to Yiddishkeit.
When they came over, they didn't know English, I imagine.
Of course not.
And it was a whole new cultural experience.
And many of the customers in the store, especially in the early years, were Polish goyim. So my father spoke Polish, my mother could manage in Polish. It was very interesting. And my parents were just good people. I told you it was in a black neighborhood, and most of the people were poor. And my parents, if they had no money, which was very common, my parents would sell them on credit. We had little sheets of paper in a little box with the name. We wrote down what they took, and then eventually, when they got a job, they would pay it off slowly. And when my parents knew that that there was no money in their house, they would make the order and throw in a can of sardines or a can of salmon, extra. Just put it in, free of charge.
In Newark, what shul did you daven and what shul did your family belong to?
Well, we started out in the old neighborhood, and I used to go to shul with my grandfather. It was a shtibel. And when I came into shul with him, the average age went down by about 30, 35 years. Give you an example of the attitude. The president of the shul, he was a Talmud Chacham, and he was the Baal Tefillah, and he could have been president of the United States. I mean, he was a strong person. And I remember one of the old-timers saying to him, Rabbi Yossel, the shul kin yingvag, wussed werden from shtibel. Rabbi Yossel, there are no young people here. What will become of the shtibel? He was a man of few words. He said, I won't bother giving you the Yiddish. He said, for us it's enough. Our children don't need it. They said about him, I'm sure it was an exaggeration, but they said about him, he had 10 children, 10 of them ate treif on Yom Kippur, 9 of them ate treif on Yom Kippur, and the 10th one, they said, ate kosher on Yom Kippur.
Wow.
My father davened in a shul with the chazan. He liked the chazan. And for Shana Yom Kippur, they had a choir also. The Rav was Rav Kulik. Choshev Litvischer Rav. You know, the kind of the old-time Rav who knew Shas and Dalet Chelkei Shulchan Aruch. And I didn't like the shul. I mean, I had no patience for a chazan. It was, you know, what does an 8-year-old need a chazan for? But and many other shuls, of course, and almost all of them, when that neighborhood dried out, when the Jews moved out, almost every single shul was sold for a church.
Tragic.
I know of only one shul that was not sold for a church. That was my grandfather's shtibel. My grandfather wasn't living anymore, and my father got involved in the shul. In fact, he turned me into a Baal Tekeya. Once he came home, I was 17. He came home with a shofar. He said the Baal Tekeya died. And this was during the summer. And he said, and you're going to blow shofar. You're going to blow shofar.
How old were you at the time?
I was 17. I had never held a shofar in my life. And I was huffing and puffing, and not a sound came out of it. And finally, I learned to blow the shofar. I've been a Baal Tekeya ever since. Wow. And we lived 2 miles away from the shul. And I walked to the shul Rosh Hashanah, and I go to the mikveh. And we knew the mikveh because the mikveh was 2 blocks away from the store. I used to deliver groceries to the mikveh lady when I was a little boy. And I come into the mikveh. I see black nuns. And they look at me, can we do something for you? And I said, I'm here, the Jewish ritual bath. Oh, that's in the basement. The owner of the building had rented it to this nunnery, and he kept the mikveh open downstairs as long as they were paying rent. Need I tell you that the mikveh was not used by many women? Rabbi Teitz at that time built a magnificent mikveh in Elizabeth. He also built a magnificent shul in the middle of the Reform area.
Now, how far was Elizabeth from Newark?
Elizabeth, the adjoining city. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth actually adjoins Newark. Mm-hmm. No boundary in between. You know, you're driving down the avenue and all of a sudden you're in Elizabeth. And obviously, people needed a mikveh. They used the Elizabeth mikveh. Give you another example of what it was like in those days. There's Rabbi Zev Siegel, the father of
Nachum.
Father of Nachum.
And Rabbi Nosson.
Right. And he had been in the Irgun in Eretz Yisrael, in Palestine, pre-Israel. And the British had a price on his head. So he came to Newark. He became Rav in the Young Israel. Mm-hmm. And he was a strapping young man, probably 6'2", very good-looking, charismatic person. Very, very fine man, really. And he decided Newark needs a mikveh. And he organized it. He organized the campaign. And the older Rabbanim did not participate. Because what happened not only in Newark, but in most Jewish cities in America, they gave up hope. They didn't feel it was possible to raise religious Jews in America. They gave up. And Rabbi Siegel was not that way. He was young and dynamic and forceful. So we bought a building. I was a teenager. I wasn't part of the building, but it was a community. And the Jewish neighbors protested. It's a bathhouse. This is a residential neighborhood. You're not allowed to have a bathhouse in a residential neighborhood. And the Rabbanim said, it's a religious function. It's not a bathhouse. Orthodox Jews must have a mikveh. There was a hearing in City Hall, the zoning board, and they tried to pack the hall. They asked the Yeshiva Bochrim to come. I was in Torah Vodaas in Williamsburg then. I came. Many of the Yeshiva Bochrim came. I must tell you, it was an embarrassment. Jews were getting up and saying, in Europe they needed it because there was no indoor plumbing. If there wouldn't be a mikveh, nobody would ever take a bath. But we don't need this. And we lost. We lost. And finally, we bought a building on an avenue that did not have that kind of zoning. So Baruch Hashem, there was a mikveh in Newark. But just to give you an idea of the obstacles to Jewish life, and Newark was a typical city. Newark was not at all unusual.
It was definitely a different world, and I imagine that going on into your next stage in life and going to a yeshiva like Torah Vodaas was an anomaly for an American kid. How many American kids, first of all, how many yeshivas were there to go to?
There were very, very few. Tveres Yerushalayim was it was a thriving yeshiva, but it was small, not nearly as big as Torah Vodaas. You had Chaim Berlin, and I don't know. I mean, you had Baltimore, and you had yeshivas. I doubt when I came to Torah Vodaas, 1945. I don't know if there were more than 5 or 6 yeshivas of that type in the country.
Right. And you joined Torah Vodaas. What was your initial feeling when you did so? You hadn't been exposed to that type of intense Torah learning, that environment. Big Talmidei Chachamim.
I loved it.
You loved it.
I loved it. Let me tell you, we had, started out in the 6th grade. The Rebbe was Rav Kaplan, Reb Hirsch Kaplan. He was the Melamed of Reb Chaim Epstein's father in the town of Meir, in Litza. Wow. He was a magnificent Rebbe. I must tell you something about him. He taught us Digduk, like his shtick was, he would have on the board skippers. He'd make a list of the best boys in the class, and they're going to skip. He's going to see to it that they go from the 6th grade into the 8th grade. And I can tell you names of some of the skippers, really distinguished Talmidei Chachamim. And then this became Behema, 15. 15 meant that he's going to keep you in for 15 minutes after yeshiva, and a list of names. We knew that, he loved us, and we loved him. There was this list of the 15-minute behemoths, and the principal came in, Dr. Stern, one of the truly great men in the history of the growth of the Orthodox community. Dr. Stern came in, and Rabbi Kaplan turned white. These names are on the board. He went over to the board like this, stood at the board. He erased those names with the back of his capote. And we turned, when Dr. Stern left and he turned around, the back of his capote was white from the chalk. And I've often said, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbeinu, in the Mishnah, he said he saw Reb Meir from the back. If he had seen Reb Meir from the front, he would have been even greater. We saw Reb Meir from the back. You can hear 100 Musar Shmusen, and it won't affect you as much as seeing this man, our Rebbe, erasing those names from the bad list and looking at his back, and his back is white from chalk.
Showed how much he cared about the boys.
Yeah.
And like you said, he loved you and you loved him. And
well, when I was in Mesivta, a couple of years later, it was a 10-minute walk from the Mesivta Torah Vodaas to Yeshiva Torah. A lot of times on Friday after class, we finished before the Yeshiva Torah, we went to visit him.
Mm-hmm. And that relationship sustained.
Not really, but it lasted for a couple of years.
Right.
And look, we all speak of him with intense admiration.
Great lesson. Now, as you moved through Torah Vodaas to Mesivta and then to Beis Medrash, who were the other people who influenced you?
Well, and it sounds corny, but I never had a Rebbe that I didn't like. And I had Rav Pam, third year Mesivta, what today would be called 11th grade. And that was before he had a beard. But, the tzidkus, besides the Talmud Chacham that we all know, the edelkeit, the warmth, the sweetness, and all with low key. He was not the dramatic Rebbe. He never was a dramatic Rebbe.
Right.
But he was the image of what a Talmud Chacham should be. And then in my Mesivta years, Rav Gedalia Shur, we idolized him. Rav Aaron Kotler said he was the first American Godel. He came to America when he was probably about 12 years old, but essentially he grew up in America. He spoke English. Most of our Rebbeim did not speak English. Learning in those days was Yiddish. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, I was in Rav Pam's class for a year. We did not know that he could speak English.
Now, at home, you were speaking English or Yiddish to your parents?
My parents spoke Yiddish, and I answered in English. But I learned Yiddish at home. I learned Yiddish from my parents. Mm-hmm. We had boys coming from out of town who couldn't speak Yiddish, and they picked it up in the yeshiva. I was fortunate, Baruch Hashem, I had Yiddish-speaking parents. I spoke Yiddish at home when I was growing up, and then I started speaking English, and they answered me in Yiddish, and we managed.
Right. And what did Rav Shor do for you, both as a Rebbe and also in developing your learning style?
Well, Rav Shor, first of all, was a role model. He was young. He was a very handsome man, and to young American boys, that meant something. I would never say that the godless of Rav Shor was that he was good looking. No, of course not. But to young boys, he was that meant something, and he spoke our language. He understood us. The first time I heard him was, it was 1948. I was in first year Mesifta, ninth grade. And Rabbi Zlotowitz, was the menayel of the yeshiva, but he was already not well at all. At that point, he had a very serious heart condition. He had to be in bed almost all day. And he appointed Rabbi Yankiv Kamenetsky Zatzal, and Rav Shor Zatzal as co-menalim. The original title was menal. They became Rosh Yeshiva later. Mm-hmm. Of course, they were both Magidei Sheah. They were both Rosh Yeshiva in the sense that they said Shiurim in the Beis Medrash.
And they gave the same level Shear? Or was it 1 year and then...
No, Rabbi Yankiv, when Rabbi Yankiv had taught Chulin Yerodea. Mm-hmm. And Rav Shor had a Beis Medrash Shear. And then later, he, after a couple of years as menal, he had to give up the Shear because there's too many responsibilities. He was saying the Shear in his office, maybe a dozen talmidim in his office, and constant interruptions because he was the menayel of the big Yeshiva. Torah Vodaas in those days had 1,500 talmidim.
Wow.
The dormitory had 300 boys. Torah Vodaas was the biggest dormitory yeshiva of the mainstream yeshivas. But the first time I heard him was when he became menayel. I was 12 years old, the first year Mesifta, and he spoke. He spoke for the he spoke for the out-of-towners. He spoke for the out-of-towners, and he said, the pasuk says that Moshe Rabbeinu lived near the Oyel Moed, near the Mishkan, and Kol Mevakesh Hashem would come to him, and he said, "You are Mevakshe Hashem. You left your homes, you're coming to yeshiva to learn. You're Mevakshe Hashem." I'm like, wow. Me and Moshe Rabbeinu, Mevakshe Hashem. And he said a very interesting thing. He had a gift. He had a gift for expression. He said, at that time, the Pirchei Agudas Yisrael in Williamsburg was very strong. And a lot of Bochum became involved as leaders or helpers in one way or another, and which he encouraged. However, he wanted, don't overdo it. And he said, you have to work for the tzibur, but don't forget the yochid was ruf sich ich. Don't forget the individual who's called me. You're young, you're in the stage of life where you have to grow, and don't neglect your own growth. My first personal experience with him, I was in Rav Pam's class, and the Rav Pam brought him in to prepare the class. They were about the same age, or close personal friends. They grew up together in Torah Vodaas. And he brought Rav Shor in to prepare the class. He prepared the class, and he asked me, it's a Tosfos in Gittin. He asked me, shot in the Tosfos. And I said the Tosfos, and he kept on. And finally, I said, the Teres Gittin, which was one of the major Mefarshim, Amsach Gittin. The Teres Gittin asked 14 kashas on this Tosfos, and he said, Ef Shalah Hamida. There's no way to figure out the Tosfos. And he left.
And he left you alone?
Yeah, left me alone. I was doing pretty well until then, but couldn't expect me to be smarter than the Teres Gittin, could you? And a few days later, I was walking down the hall, and he was coming from the other direction. He gave me a big smile. That made my day, it made my week, it made my month. But I became, Baruch Hashem, I had a tremendous zechus. I became close to him.
And how many years did you learn by Rav Shor?
I was never in his class.
You were never in his shir?
Never in his shir.
Wow. Because we hear you quote him copiously in speeches and writings.
He used to, now it's the Sefer Gedal Yohu exists. And I was able to get one of his sons made tapes of his shmusim, and he let me make copies.
Mm-hmm.
And Rav Shor said a chumash shir every morning for half an hour. A phenomenal shir. I mean, he had total recall. He could mention 20, 25 different mefarshim in the course of the shir. And, you know, Erged Al Yohu is a very popular sefer, and deservedly so. Erged Al Yohu consists of the shmuz in the last 3 years of his life, when he was not in good health. And, you know, in the old days, people did not have sense to record shiurim. Today, everything is on CD. Everything is available. In those days, it wasn't done.
Mm.
I just imagine, just think for a minute. If we could have the shiurim of the Torah Vodaas Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Shlomo Hyman, Rav Shor, Rav Yankov, Rav Chazan, Rav Sheps, Rav Epstein, there's hardly anything available.
Was that because there was no such a thing, or just because people didn't think of it that way?
Well,
were there recording devices at the time?
There were recording devices. They were big, heavy, literally heavy,
Mm-hmm.
and clumsy, and not cassettes, round, big reels, and the tape would often get stuck.
Mm-hmm.
But then it was frowned upon. You don't record a shir, you had to listen to a shir.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to take notes, but you listen to a shir. It's not a performance. But then later it became the thing to do.
Now you mentioned Rav Chazan, who I believe was giving the highest shir in Torah Vodaas when you were there.
Right.
And after you completed his shir, you moved on to Beis Medrash
Went to
Elyon.
Beis Medrash Elyon, right.
Who made that decision for you, that would be the direction to take?
Well, you know, if you were a good bocher and you wanted to learn, Beis Medrash Elyon was a place to go. The only comparable yeshiva to Beis Medrash Elyon was Lakewood. And in those years, Beis Medrash Elyon was bigger and a higher quality than Lakewood.
Mm-hmm. And who
For
were
a very simple reason, because Torah Vodaas, Beis Medrash Elyon had bochrim who went through Torah Vodaas.
So it was like a feeder. We had
some outsiders coming also.
Right.
For example, Rav Shmuel Tobenfeld, you know, one of the great ge'onim of the period. Nebuchadnezzar was nifter at the age of 56 or 57. But he came from Europe after the war, and he came straight to Rav Chazan Shir, Beis Medrash Elyon. But it was taken for granted. If you were a good bocher and you wanted to learn, you went to Beis Medrash Elyon.
Who were some of your contemporaries at the time in Beis Medrash Elyon?
Mendel Weinbach, Nissen Wolpin, Reuben Scheiner, Rav Chaim Baruch Wolpin, the other Wolpin brothers, Rav Kalevsky, who was Rosh Yeshiva in Newark, Reb Moshe David Steinwartzel, who was Rosh Yeshiva in Bobev. It was really an honor roll.
Wow. And the Rosh
Reb
Yeshiva
Simcha Shustel,
and Reb Simcha
Reb Donen
Shustel.
Garsher.
Right. And the Rosh Yeshiva were Reb Gedalia Shor and Reb Reuven Grzovsky at the time.
Well, Reuven Grzovsky was Rosh Yeshiva in Beis Medrash Elyon and in Torah Vodaas.
Right.
And
was there a daily or weekly shir delivered by either of them at the time?
no.
No. So you learned Bechabura, you learned
You learned the
Chavrusas.
Chavrusa, and Reb Reuven had the stroke actually 2 years before I came to this. I never heard a shir from him.
Mm-hmm.
He had a stroke just when I was coming in to the Beis Medrash. And I was mishamish him. I was a big schus when he was in the hospital in Columbia Presbyterian. There were times when I was there overnight in Muncie.
Mm-hmm.
We took turns, we took shifts, staying with him overnight. I blew shofar for him. He couldn't come to the yeshiva, he was paralyzed. But even though he wasn't saying shiurim during my time in Beis Medrash Elyon, but the aura was still there. When you spoke about the Rosh Yeshiva, it was Reuven. You know, the atmosphere that he created remained. And especially since when I came in, there's still older Bochrim who had heard shiurim from him.
And at the time, Beis Medrash Elyon's in Monsey, and your parents were still living in Newark at the time. Right. How often did you get to go home and see them?
In Beis Medrash Elyon, the takana was you went home for a Shabbos once in 6 weeks. If you wanted to cheat, you went once in 5 weeks. But that was it. You know, there was no policeman. There was a mashgiach. There was an Adam Godel Admoid, Rabbi Chaim Kaplan. But he wasn't the mashgiach in the sense that he took attendance and he was down your back. He was the mashpia, the classic mashgiach.
And you were in Beis Medrash Elyon when you reached marriageable age. What happened at that point when you entered the Parsha of Shidduchim?
Well, I went out like everybody else. I had Siyata D'Shmaya. My wife, Alera Shalom, was the second young woman that I saw. So Baruch Hashem, I had tremendous Siyata D'Shmaya. Not only that I didn't have to keep going on and on and on, but to have such a wife. And then I was in the kollel for 4 years.
Post-marriage, you learned for 4 years, and then at that point, what did you feel you wanted to do, we would call it career-wise?
I wanted to be in chinuch. And I was promised a Mesifta position in a certain yeshiva, and I don't want to get into names, as you'll understand why in a few seconds. And then there was a machlokes in the yeshiva, and I was considered to be too close to the losing side. And the winning side decided that how could I be loyal? Maybe they couldn't trust me. All right, so I ended up working being a shipping manager for a year. This happened during the summer, and I was high and dry. And then Baruch Hashem, Reb Lipa Margolis, the founder and the head of Yeshiva Torah Tamima, which at that time was called Torah Vodaas at Flatbush, he called me, he offered me a position, and I was there for 8 years.
In what capacity?
I was a Rebbe all 8 years. I was also Sagan Menayel. Okay. And for the last 3 years, I was English principal. And then I went to Stolin. I was a Menayel in Stolin for 6 years. And then Meir Zlotowitz enticed me, twisted my arm, and brought me into ArtScroll.
And who made that shidduch between you and Reb Meir?
A very interesting story. My very dear friend, Rabbi Nosson Scherman, was editor of the Jewish Observer. And I used to write articles occasionally. He asked me to write. I wrote articles. I wrote an article about the Chafetz Chaim coming to the first Knessia Gedola in Vienna. It's called Chafetz Chaim in Vienna. And Meir read it, and he liked it. And they had Avi Shulman, who's himself one of the really, really good people in American chinuch. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, Avi Shulman.
Sure.
Okay. And at that time, he was working for ArtScroll. That was before ArtScroll was ArtScroll.
So ArtScroll at the time was a studio?
At ArtScroll was a studio, did wedding invitations and did brochures and colored, plaques and things like that. That's where the name ArtScroll came from. Artistic scrolls. And Meir said to him, I'd love to meet the person who wrote this article. And Avi said, he's my friend. And he introduced us. And so then occasionally Meir would ask me to write copy for a brochure that he was doing. And then, little by little, the friendship developed, the relationship developed. And when he was embarked on doing Megillas Esther, you know the story of Megillas Esther.
Right, I mean, it's quite well known by now.
Yeah.
But when you were doing that initial copywriting for Reb Meir, you were still in a chinuch position.
I was still in the chinuch position.
You're still working in chinuch, doing
And,
that on the side.
Anybody in a chinuch position, then even more than now,
Even today, right.
when you have Kanan Hori, you have a growing family, you need some side income,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the good old days, if you were only 2 months behind in salary, you were doing very
Good
well. It was unusual to be only 2 months behind.
Right.
So some side income never hurt. And so he was doing Megillas Esther, and he asked me if I would edit. And I edited afternoon and evening. And
I'm
then
curious about that. We know the well-known story about how Reb Meir undertook to write Megillas Esther, Lila Nishmas, his chaver, Reb Meir Fogel. Now, did he give you the manuscript as he was writing to edit, or did he finish the whole manuscript and then give it to you?
As he was doing it.
As he was doing
it. It was being typeset, and I got the galleys, and I edited the galleys.
So it was being sent to Reb Sheah Brander to do the actual typesetting, and you were editing that, or were you editing his written notes?
No, I edited after it was typed.
If it was typed. And what did you think, what was your first reaction to this commentary that was being written by Reb Meir? It turned out to be revolutionary, but did you realize that at the time?
No, I didn't. I didn't realize at the time. I thought I was just doing a favor for a friend. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know that he would pay me. He asked me to help out, so I helped out, and then all of a sudden there's a check. And then he asked me to do an introduction,
right,
which we called an overview. An overview became the standard.
Sure.
Your overview. About 50, 60 overviews since
right.
then. I've never.
It became synonymous with the ArtScroll volumes.
Right.
And so let's talk about that for a moment, the overview. How do you go about writing an overview? Do you have certain svarim that you go to? Do you sit on it and think about it for a few days? What's the process?
I start learning svarim. But in the early days, what I remembered from Rav Shur, there was nothing in writing yet. I would look in Sasemis, I would look in Rav Tzadok, look in Meir. I would just immerse myself in the subject, and then I would start writing. I remember the first couple of overviews. We lived in Borough Park, and I went to a library, public library. I think it was in Bensonhurst. I didn't want to do it in Borough Park because I knew people to come in and they started talking. So I sort of wanted to isolate myself. I had a couple of svarim with me, and I wrote. I couldn't type. I'd never typed in my life.
So writing longhand?
Writing longhand. And it just took shape as I was writing. I was never disciplined enough, and still am not disciplined enough, to make an outline. Mm-hmm. I just write. I immerse myself in the subject, and I have ideas, what I want to say, and I start writing, and the writing takes shape as I'm doing it.
Can I ask how long an overview took at that time and over the years? How many hours are we talking about?
I couldn't break it down into hours. It's in terms of time, it's also hard because I would be learning things. When the Sefer is in progress, I'll be doing an overview. So during my free time, at night or on Shabbos or Sunday, I'll be looking at svarim. Mm-hmm. How many hours that took? Who knows? There's only Rabbi Scherman knows. The actual writing could take a week or so.
Now, getting back to the Megillas Esther, you edit the manuscript, you finish the overview, Reb Meir releases the Megas Hester, and the feedback is just off the charts.
Off the charts.
What was that like for you when you started hearing that it's selling 20,000 copies, I think it was, within the first...
I think it was 25.
25 within the first...
Between 20 and 25 for sure.
Within the first year. And then Reb Meir contacts you again. What was the next step?
Well, you know, it was supposed to be a one-shot thing. It was this memorial zikaron for his dear friend, and that's all. I mean, my career was chinuch, and his career was ArtScroll Studio. But it took off, and people encouraged us, you have to continue. You see, what happened was that, you know, there was the old cliche, an idea whose time had come. It's very important to understand the role of ArtScroll and why ArtScroll had to continue. It's very important to understand this. You had a generation and a half of bochurim who went to yeshiva and girls who went to Beis Yaakov. Some went post-high school and some didn't go post-high school, but learning a sefer was an effort. We could read, but learning was hard. So here you have something for the very first time. It was really the very first time. It gives you a sefer in Tanakh, and it gives you a readable commentary and an introduction, and it's in your language, and decently written. Hey, where was this? Why didn't I have this when I was in yeshiva? So the idea whose time had come, nobody realized it until then.
I would add also...
Meir didn't realize it until then. It was only after Megillas Esther came out that we realized that something happened. Rabbi Nosson made this accident happen.
Right. I just wanted to add that the fact that it was authoritative and scholarly as well, meaning that it was on an acceptable level as far as Torah scholarship.
Mm-hmm. The level of scholarship is not comparable to what we have today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that kind of manuscript today would not be accepted. Mm-hmm. Baruch Hashem, we've come a long way since then.
Right.
But at the time, it was a good job. Don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. It really was a good job, more than just acceptable.
Right.
And we were encouraged to continue. How can you stop? Don't you see how important it is? So we went on to Megillas Rus, and then...
And again, you were doing the editing and the overview.
Right.
Reb Meir did the commentary.
And I was still in the yeshiva.
And you were still in yeshiva.
Yeah, and I was in the yeshiva for another year after that. Mm-hmm. And then, also another a milestone. We got a letter from Rav Gifter, Zichron Livracha, saying how much he enjoyed it and how important it is and how very, very complimentary. And a man of that stature takes the trouble to write a 2-page handwritten letter.
And he didn't know any of you personally at the time?
No. Neither one of us.
Wow.
And so Meir said, we have to go and visit him. So we made an appointment, and we flew out to Cleveland. We had lunch with him. And his son-in-law, Avram Chaim Foyer, came in the middle and sat with us, and he became one of our very popular authors. And Rav Gifter said that he would like to participate. He says, send him galleys and he'll comment, which he did for a couple of years. We sent him galleys, and he sent back notes.
Fascinating.
Which was very important for another reason. Because of all the great Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Gifter was the one who was absolutely fluent in English.
He was American-born.
He was American-born.
Right.
And so, at meetings with the other Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Yankov, Rav
Moshe.
Ruderman, he spoke about this, and he spoke about how important it is, and how important it is to encourage it, which opened the door for us. I had become close to Rabbi Yankov over the years. In the later years in Torah Vodaas and in Muncie, especially after my marriage, he was my Masada Kedushin, and my wife's family was very close to Rabbi Yankov. So through them, I developed a much closer relationship to him. And Rabbi Yankov was a man, he didn't just give out complimentary letters. He measured every word. He heard from Rav Gifter, and he asked Rabbi Elias, Rabbi Yosef Elias, to read some of our Svarim and report to him. And Rabbi Elias said that they are good. Mm-hmm. So Rabbi Yankov became our foremost supporter.
How long did it take till you decide to move out of the realm of chinuch and throw yourself full-time into what had become now a major endeavor of dissemination of Torah?
Yeah, well, I started working on Megillas Esther, must be around Hanukkah time, and it came out before Purim in 1976. And I finished out that year in Stolin, working full-time in Stolin and full-time in ArtScroll. How do you do that? I don't know, but it happened. And the next year I went into ArtScroll full-time.
And at the time, Reb Sheah Brander was doing the design, you were doing the editing.
Reb Sheah was part of ArtScroll Studios.
He was part of ArtScroll Studios. And what was your next big project that you worked on once the Megillas had been put out?
The Chumash, Meir's Bereshis, masterpiece.
Right.
Masterpiece. It's one of the tragedies, one of the minor tragedies, but a tragedy in Jewish life, that he wasn't able to continue and do the other Chumoshim because his responsibilities just increased to the point where he could not manage to sit and write anymore.
And after that, you undertook to put out the Siddur.
The Mishnayos.
Or the Mishnayos first.
Right. And
again, your role was doing the major editing?
Editing, yeah.
And who was writing
There was a time when I edited everything. Mm-hmm. And after a few years, that became impossible.
Right.
So there were projects that I edited, and I did some, I wrote and I edited, and I was available whenever I was needed for anybody else. But it's just impossible to read everything, and certainly impossible to edit everything.
So you complete the Megillas, Mishnayos, as you mentioned before, the Chumash Sefer Bereshis that Meir wrote, and the next big project is the ArtScroll Siddur. Mm-hmm. What was the process and the evolution of writing the translation and the commentary for what would become Klal Yisrael's go-to Siddur with an English translation?
Interesting story. We have somebody who was working with us at the time in charge of sales, Steve Blitz. Now he's in charge of our Israel office. Meir and I wanted to do a siddur like the Bereshis. There'll be 4 or 5 volumes and a complete and explain everything and bring the Mefarshim. And Blitz said, "You're crazy. Who's going to use such a siddur? You need a siddur that people will use in shul. You need a siddur that people can actually daven from every day." And he was right. Oh, was he right? So anyway, the idea of the siddur was, first of all, the translation had to be accurate, but also it had to be readable. And the commentary had 2 goals. First of all, to explain the difficult language, things that have to be explained in the siddur, obviously. But more than that, we wanted the siddur to be something that would inspire people. They would daven, they would have feeling for what they're davening. It could affect them, it could affect their lives. And so when I chose what to include in the Siddur, aside from Pshat, of course, which is essential, you have to explain, people have to understand what they're saying. But aside from that, the commentary had to be something that would appeal to people, that would make them feel closer to God. And Baruch Hashem, we had Siyata D'Shmaya. It clicked. Over the years, we've had any number of people who've called us or who met us or who wrote us that the Siddur changed their lives. And more than a few who said they became Bali Tshuva because of the Siddur.
And the Siddur was unique because not only did you have a commentary, but it also had instructions, which I think is an overlooked but a very, very important component.
Yeah. Like Avi Gold, who was one of our editors at the time, Avi said, it tells you when to hop, skip, and jump.
Exactly.
And that's also something, it's true.
And no other Siddur had that before.
Exactly.
And over here it was clear.
Plus the collection of dinim in the back.
Right, absolutely. That was also important. But in writing the commentary, was there a system that you used to decide what to include and what not to? I'm sure on a certain level it was harder to cut down than it was to find material because, like you said, you could have written 5 volumes on the Siddur. So what system do you use to determine what to include and what not to?
I try to put myself into the position of the reader. Give you an example. When I was in Rav Palm's class, we spoke about Rav Palm before, I asked Rav Palm, what could I undertake, another limud aside from the regular yeshiva curriculum? And he said, learn Nevi'im Rishonim with the Mitzudas. And it was, what the Mitzudas does, what I felt at the time, is as if I was writing it, because he just tells you what you need to understand what the Pasuk is saying. So, in response to your question, how did I pick what to include? First of all, I put myself into the position of a reader who doesn't know much about the Siddur, which was very easy for me because I didn't know much about the Siddur either. What do I need to understand it? And also something that appealed to me, that inspired me when I read it, and I felt that it would inspire the other readers as well, I would put that in. I avoided complicated things. Because when somebody's davening, you're not learning Be'iyun. Mm-hmm. It's more like Daf Yomi than an Iyun Seder.
Right. Now the style of the Siddur, with the Hebrew on one side, English on the other, commentary on bottom, was that the initial vision that you had for the Siddur?
Yeah, because that's what we had in the Mishnayos and the Chumash also.
Right. Because it's interesting that later on, transliterated became a popular option. And
translinear.
Translinear, not transliterated, correct. What we call interlinear, rather.
Mm-hmm.
There is a transliterated Siddur, but that's something else entirely.
Right.
So the interlinear option, some people like, but you went with the opposite pages and with the commentary on bottom, and that it took off. I mean, the Siddur has sold literally millions of copies.
Right, it's true.
And is still to this day the classic Siddur. You could say it stood the test of time. And
true.
It must be an incredible feeling to have impacted people's tefillah in that fashion.
It's humbling to feel that Rabbanu Shalom let me be the shliach to do that. I don't have the words to describe it, but it's humbling.